The unanimous opinion about From Software's DLCs is that they never really miss. They're not all perfect, and this video will discuss that, but I think they're all pretty good. I've never bought a From Software DLC and thought that I was ripped off, and From Software also doesn't do the so-called DLCs that are just flat-out ripoffs to exploit money from their fanbase. What they do is really respectable and admirable. And the best part about From Software DLC is they always have some of the best bosses and levels to play in. So, with all of that out of the way, today's video is going to be ranking every single DLC that From Software has made. I'm going to be starting off our list today with a Dark Souls 2 DLC. I know it's become somewhat of an unspoken fact by this point, but I don't like Dark Souls 2. It's simply not something I look forward to playing. But for this video specifically, I went back and played all of Dark Souls 2's DLCs, so they're relatively fresh on my mind. And before I go into my reasoning as to why I had this one dead last, I have to say they're not bad. Even this DLC is quite okay. And if I were judging from a value perspective, I would give this DLC a solid thumbs up. Dark Souls 2's DLCs released for $10 a pop according to Google, and even though they're all relatively short, they're good for $10. And not only that, but they even bring Dark Souls 2 up to Souls standard. Seriously, this DLC isn't my favorite Souls content by any means, but I can't deny that it's still pretty good, and it laps any of the content we saw in the base game of Dark Souls 2. See, Dark Souls 2 fans, I can say something positive about your favorite game, but don't expect it to be the norm outside of this video. This is the only bone I'll throw you, so I hope you savor it. And now that the Dark Souls 2 fans have their bone, I have to say that there are a lot of issues with this DLC. Where should I start? Well, we have 3 bosses, 2 of them are pretty bad and uninteresting. The frigid outskirts exist, and I don't like snowy areas in games. But even with these missteps, I can't deny they at least took a shot and put in genuine effort with what's on offer here. Exploring this level when it's frozen and when it's thawed is quite interesting. It reuses the content in a way that's better than what they usually do. Is Blue Smelter Demon reusing assets in a way that makes it interesting? No, it is not. But having all the mist and fog removed makes coming through this place again inherently more interesting. I also like the enemies here. I even like how they reused Jabba the Hutt and put him in as a level boss. Because when you fight him as an actual boss, you sigh at yet another awful Dark Souls 2 boss. But when I'm not distracted by the fact that he is a boss, I chuckle at how he moves. I want to continue with the fact that this DLC took a shot, and I respect that. And I love how they handled the final boss in this DLC. I don't typically summon in these games, but I do appreciate how FromSoft took the extra step to make summoning feel more interactive than simply pressing a few buttons. This DLC has these knights you can find, and they will aid you in combat for the final boss. So going around and finding these knights is a lot more interesting than even the Radon Festival, in my opinion. Radon's encounter works perfectly fine for what it does, but when you arrive at the festival, you interact with a few NPCs and you're set on your way. I enjoyed earning these summons because it makes having an ally feel more interesting for me. So yeah, I am capable of saying something positive about Dark Souls 2. A final note for all of Dark Souls 2's DLCs in general is the fact that they make some questionable decisions, to say the least. Each DLC has this major flaw that's so apparent and so obvious. FromSoft knew that Frigid Outskirts was annoying. They also knew fighting these 2 wasn't going to be interesting in the slightest. And these are pretty offensive. But the future DLCs have the same issue with horrible boss runbacks and poorly done asset stretches. For $10, I think the content is good enough to warrant a purchase from every Souls fan, but literally no one enjoys the pain that we're going to be talking about with the other 2 DLCs. Sticking with Dark Souls 2 is Crown of the Sunken King. I know it makes Dark Souls 2 look somewhat bad having 2 out of the 3 DLCs at the very bottom, but something to remember is that again, these were $10 a piece. So you can only expect so much content and quality for such a fair asking price. And I have to say, this DLC is good. I can't think of any other level that's in the Souls games that has the atmosphere and environment that this DLC has. So I have to say that alone is a real positive for me here. FromSoft didn't just stick with a fancy castle or a city. I genuinely adored the Sanctum City's general atmosphere and vibe. I know that From Software taking a shot was a bit of a theme on the last section, so I'm going to stick with that for the time being. Even though the raising platforms are a bit gimmicky and relatively easy to operate, using these raising platforms to use the level hazards to your advantage makes interacting with this level a lot more interesting. And that's something I appreciate a lot. I can't think of any other From Software level that allows you to gain an advantage through abusing the level like this one does. This idea hasn't been used in recent memory, but at least they tried. You know, maybe that's what Dark Souls 2 fans see in this game that I simply don't. And yeah, the level enemies in this DLC are pretty forgettable. FromSoft put a lot of effort into making a new way to interact with level design and made boring and bland level enemies in return. But what's a DLC without talking about the bosses? I think the bosses in this DLC have the weakest bosses in all of Dark Souls 2's DLC packs. I don't think any of the bosses are great, they're barely okay. To get the obvious out of the way, the Gang Squad is just an awful fight. It feels like From Software had one goal with designing this, and it's to waste the player's time. The run back to this fight is a waste of time, and the fight itself is also a waste of time, with nothing interesting being presented. I don't even think this trio is particularly hard, but it's just an excuse to fill playtime. I know everyone hates this fight, so let's move on to the two main fights, and I still don't think they're all that interesting. Starting off with Ilana, she has a pretty interesting idea of being able to summon minions to aid her in the fight. She can even summon a boss, which killed me on my first attempt fighting her. But when you get a summon that's easy to deal with, she is an uninteresting fight to actually interact with. On my kill encounter, she summoned these gold skeletons, and I was left with a sigh when I killed her. I've killed skeletons in these games before, so fighting Ilana, who doesn't have a lot of HP, and fighting these skeletons was very, very easy. And after reading that back, I stand by what I said, but I also have to admit that I am judging this next to all of FromSoft's newer DLCs and in the year 2024. When this DLC released all those years ago, I think I would have a lot of positive things to say about her. A boss like Artorias, for example, is still a masterpiece by today's standards. Ilana, on the other hand, gets a shoulder shrug from me. And ending the bosses section is Sin the Dragon, and he's better than Ilana, but still manages to reach the meh mark. I do need to be clear that Midir has definitely spoiled me with dragon fights, and I have to assume that making a dragon boss is harder than a standard knight or warrior type boss. So again, if I was judging this boss like someone would when he was released all those years ago, then maybe I would have talked about him as highly as I do Midir. But Sin is at least unique, and relies on fighting with unique moves instead of summoning unlike Ilana. The most annoying thing about him is the fact that your weapon will most likely break in the middle of his fight. I had to use two different swords on my kill for the fact that my weapon broke mid-fight. Part of this is definitely my fault since I didn't have repair powder equipped and underestimated how much damage my weapon was actually taking. Some of you may be wondering why I find this to be so annoying, as I don't find using consumables versus Moog, for instance, as annoying as what Sin does. And it's the fact that I can still play the game if I do take Moog or Millennia's debuff. But making it so players will be essentially doing 0 damage if they do fail to repair their weapon is fairly uninteresting to me. I should also note that I'm not a fan of Calamity in Dark Souls 1 either, so I don't tend to care as much for dragon boss fights. This wraps up the second Dark Souls 2 DLC, and while I did have plenty of negatives to say, I appreciate what they did here, or attempted at least. I'll talk about this when I get around to the final DLC pack, but just try and think of what $10 DLCs are today. Most of them are overpriced cosmetics. I don't remember what DLC was like back in 2014, but I have to assume FromSoft released a completely fair add-on back then. I can tell you it's far better than most smaller DLCs, even by today's standards. Okay, let's get the next obvious one out of the way. In case you don't remember, Dark Souls 3 actually launched with a season pass. It was $25, which included the Ring City and Ashes of Ariandel. When you look at these two side by side, it's clear that the Ring City is just the better add-on. I don't exactly know why FromSoft wanted to do 2 DLCs, but I think they made the better choice in general. Ashes is a pretty small DLC. It has 1 large level, a few new enemies, 1 new awful boss, and 1 great boss. It's honestly nothing super spectacular. I think we can all agree that Ring City got most of the love, and I appreciate that. I would rather have 1 great pack and 1 forgettable pack like we got. If they try to make both equally great, we would be left with 2 just okay add-ons. So I guess we're at the point where I have to justify why I like it more than the previous 2 DLC packs. And it's really only because of Sister Frieda. I think the level enemies are better than the 2 other DLCs we spoke about, but I also think the level itself isn't all that interesting to explore. Again, going back to the statement that wandering around in snow has never been interesting to me. But the level itself feels like small packets you're going through and not something that's super connected. It's somewhat linear when I say it that way. There are enemies that are visually more interesting, and I must say this DLC shines when you're in the interior locus rather than the white monotony of the snow. And after saying that, nothing will make me enjoy the outside snow that this DLC is packed with. I also mentioned that the bosses are a highlight of this DLC, and I guess that's only half true. I will tell you about the boss that's not Sister Frieda first, and I hope to say a little, but to explain a lot. I beat Dark Souls 3 at level 1. I have killed every Dark Souls 3 boss at this level, and I don't remember anything about this specific boss. When you play a game with the intention of making the game harder, you are going to pick up on little things about a boss. It could be something as minor as watching out for certain janky hitboxes, or that one move that simply does a lot of damage. And this boss has none of that. I remember not even struggling on him at level 1. It was nothing more than a filler boss to say that this has 2 bosses instead of 1. It's not offensive like some of the other Dark Souls 2 issues we talked about earlier, but it's also not good. And Sister Frida is quite frankly amazing. She is the only reason I have this DLC higher than the other two that are below it. I've talked about her extensively on my channel, but since some of you are new viewers, I will say that she is one of the best duo fights in this franchise. Her third phase caught me off guard super hard, and she's genuinely excellent. If you want to hear more of what I have to say about her, I cover her in these videos on your screen. And I guess this section is super short, kind of like the DLC itself. I'm going to give Dark Souls 2 another compliment, so bear with me. Generally speaking, FromSoft's DLCs feel superior to the base game. They do to me at least. Dark Souls 2's DLC packs are enjoyable unlike the base game, and Ashes manages to be just more Dark Souls 3. The quality of Sister Frida is better than the base game bosses in my opinion, but the level enemies, and environment don't reach any grand new heights like the Ring City achieves. The Ring City is technically more Dark Souls 3 because it doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it's Dark Souls 3 but better in every way. And I guess that's why I don't like Ashes as much. I only want to play it for Sister Frida, but Sister Frida is worth the other stuff in between. This line could fit into the Ring City section or here, so I'm just going to throw it here. But I wish that the Ring City was the only DLC pack for Dark Souls 3, and FromSoft made it bigger and better. Shadow of the Erdtree is a $40 asking price, and the larger price tag comes with increased expectations. And with Ashes going back to the Painted World, it automatically doesn't feel as unique as it could. Imagine if we were allowed to go down to the streets of the Ring City and wasn't kept in a swampy type area. Or if we got another boss on the level of the Ring City quality, while being in the Ring City and not some snow, bland looking area. To sum up Ashes, it's not offensive in any way, but it's definitely not my favorite FromSoftware DLC. Entering the top 5 is Dark Souls 1's DLC, Artorias of the Abyss. I have to say that the jump in quality from what was on offer in the past DLCs to now is quite high. This DLC is far better than Ashes and the two other Dark Souls 2 DLCs we talked about earlier. Even by today's standards, there's a lot on offer here, and it's all pretty good. This DLC also takes the unique approach of having a peculiar way to start the DLC. It's not something simple like going to a certain bonfire to access the DLC. It's something that you are going to have to look up a guide for. This does not matter in the slightest, but I think this was perfected in Bloodborne when you get grabbed to enter the DLC. I guess I somewhat appreciate obtuse ways to enter add-on content. Anyway, this DLC wastes no time and lets you fight the Sanctuary Guardian as soon as it starts. This boss is mostly okay. It's a pretty fun way to rust off your skills if you took a break before starting the DLC itself. He's probably the weakest boss in the DLC, but fighting the duo variation as an added challenge is very fucking just obtusely hard. It's just really weird. This DLC starts to kick in gear with a rehashed level of Darkroot Garden. You're now starting to access a main chunk of the DLC, and for me, this chunk starts off quite weak. I'll bring this up in the Old Hunters, but starting off your DLC with a rehashed level kills some excitement of what's around the corner. It's a fine rehash, it's completely serviceable, but I also just don't want it. You have new enemies and everything you would expect, but it feels familiar. This one single reason is why I have Artorias of the Abyss lower than the final Dark Souls 2 DLC that I have yet to talk about. Luckily, this level is relatively short, and you can quickly go to the highlight of the DLC, which is of course, Artorias. There are a ton of great things that someone can actually say about Artorias, although I think what's more interesting is how FromSoft handled him. Not all bosses are created equally. Not every boss is designed to be a mechanically impressive highlight. FromSoft does a really good job at separating the mechanically interesting fights with a few gimmicky or puzzle-based fights. And Artorias was designed to be a mechanically interesting fight. But FromSoft wanted more than a mechanically interesting fight. They demanded a mechanically interesting fight with a cool build-up, impressive looking armor, and at the time, Artorias was a very hard 1v1 knight encounter. He's definitely harder than any other 1v1 encounter in the base game, and with everything that Artorias set out to be, it was a complete success. A boss like Manus isn't as memorable by today's standards, but Artorias? Absolutely. Everything about him sounds menacing, and even his name, Artorias, it instills dread. I think that's what I enjoy about him the most. His moveset is excellent to this day, but everything else is impeccable. Even how one of his arms is injured. It makes me wonder how powerful he was when he was at his peak. If there is a boss that I have the most respect for, then he would be near the very top. You can't not have the peak of this DLC be Artorias. His name is even in the DLC itself. Although that's not to suggest the rest of the DLC is bad, it's quite the contrary, actually. The next bosses aren't quite Artorias level, but the next level still holds up really well alongside most of Dark Souls 1's level design as a whole. I remember when I was making my video on the best levels, this one got cut just by a slim margin, because it's definitely my 11th or 12th favorite. And I'm going to quickly wrap up this section with the two remaining bosses of this DLC. These two are pretty good, but I don't find them to be outstanding by any means. Manus is an extremely fast boss, and Calamite looks cooler than he plays. And now that I've talked about the 2 DLC dragon fights, I wonder what magic From Software found that made Midir so much better than these 2. Even someone like Artorias has qualities that can hold up with Gale, but these 2, not as much for my tastes. Overall, the most important role this DLC plays is making the latter half of Dark Souls 1 less of a slog to play. I think we can all agree that Dark Souls 1 simply isn't as good after Ornstein and Smo. You have some levels that are a real drag to play, some bosses that aren't as interesting, and worst of all, Bed of Chaos. This DLC gives me a reason to not debate quitting when I have gained the ability to warp. Good job, Dark Souls 1. And before we get the 2 final ones out of the way, it's time to put Dark Souls 2 to rest. I have to say that this DLC is extraordinarily good. In terms of value proposition, it's definitely a bang for its buck. It has a really strong start in atmosphere and setting the mood. I would also go as far to say that the atmosphere here is better than the Ring City for the most part. They are both covered in ash after all. There's something I find fascinating with running up this chain just to be thrown off guard since this level is different. It's more of a downhill battle. Until Elden Ring, I can't think of too many levels that were focusing on going down instead of fighting straight ahead or fighting your way to the next bonfire. And when this level does start to kick in gear, it reveals a new mechanic that is unique to Dark Souls 2. You can use these smelter wedges in the DLC for a multitude of reasons, but most importantly, it weakens the final boss. Maybe weakens isn't the right word, it really just stops him from healing. This is another shot that Dark Souls 2 took that I respect. I'm pretty sure you can use them around the level itself to weaken enemies, but I was extremely powerful, so I saved them for the boss. I'm not exactly sure if I would like to see the smelter wedge idea done again in future games, but I still enjoy its placement in this DLC. But of course, this DLC shoots itself in the foot like every other Dark Souls 2 DLC. This DLC has 3 bosses and 2 of them are really good. They are at least high B tier bosses, I would say. The problem is with Sir alone. The boss runback is just put simply horrible. It's worse than any other runback I've seen. It's got to the point where I made the conclusion that the runback is more challenging than the boss itself, and the boss is pretty hard. Having boss runbacks in general just kind of annoys me, and I think that Plusutasax is an annoying runback, and he isn't even comparable to what Dark Souls 2 offers. It's not justifiable for these runbacks to exist. It has made me come to the conclusion that I will never kill Sir alone again. I can only assume From Software tried to milk every last bit of playtime so they would avoid players downvoting the DLC because it's only 2 hours long. But in return, they made this content forever annoying. Was it worth it? I don't think so. To wrap up this DLC, it's good. Great even. I love what's on offer here. The 2 bosses are really good. The vertically inclined level speaks loudly to me. It's fun. But Dark Souls 2 couldn't have something that's pure. Our next 2 DLCs are very close to being pure. Nothing is perfect, everything has flaws. But nothing in these next 2 are so pesky that it's a turnoff for me. So, what's next? The Old Hunters or the Ring City? I know that most people would swap the Old Hunters and the Ring City. I get it. I asked my audience what DLC they liked more, and the Old Hunters won out by a pretty heavy margin. And to be clear, these DLCs are mostly tied. I will go into why I had this DLC at second and not in first, but I love them both. Bloodborne is my favorite From Software game, and I have to say that Bloodborne's DLC did everything it needed to do. We all know that Yharnam and slaying beasts and the gothic horror that's knitted into Bloodborne's core is the highlight of this game. We all agree on that. But I think we can also agree that Bloodborne's base game bosses are, well, they're just okay. There are some good ones, my favorite being Father Gascoigne, but I also like Ligarius and Gehrman. But you also have some stinkers like Mikolash, the Witches of Hemwick, Rom the Vacuous Spider, and I can go on. And the Old Hunters fixed that. The 3 big bosses of this DLC are great, impeccable even. In fact, I love them so much that the big 3 made it into my top 10 favorite boss list. They're great, and they fix Bloodborne's biggest weakness. I hold the Ring City in a slightly higher regard for one simple reason, and if you were around for the Dark Souls 1 section, I think you can guess why. The start of this DLC is simply not as interesting as the rest of the DLC itself. It's a rehashed level. It's new enough, but not completely new. The longer the first section of the DLC goes on, the more new it feels. But even the short 15 minutes you're in the rehashed version still takes away part of the magic of entering a new From Software DLC. We see a lot of new enemy types, my favorite being this weird guy at the top of the staircase. You can also see hunters stuck in this version of the nightmare. Hunter NPC fights are usually quite unbalanced in Bloodborne, but they aren't here, and it's really great to see that. They're more engaging to fight than the usual bullet spam fest they turn into. And once you get past Vicar Amelia's boss fight, the DLC starts to become more interesting. The introduction is really just a way to insert your foot in the door for the real fight to begin. Because very quickly, the game introduces you to my second favorite boss in the entire series, and that's Ludwig. Yes, you heard that right, a game that is 9 years old manages to have my second favorite boss fight. I have talked about Ludwig extensively in my favorite bosses video, so I'll try and limit my love for this guy. But a part of me just can't hold myself back. I think Ludwig is a near perfect boss fight. His stark transition from phase 1 to phase 2, his OST that's screaming at you, and his immense, large, and gripping stature that demands respect. That's honestly my favorite thing about this guy, because I can't think of any other game that has a huge horse that wields a weapon 5 times larger than the player as a boss. There's only one change. One single change I would alter with this boss. Since phase 1 and phase 2 is such an immense and gripping transition, a part of me wishes we had 2 health bars, not just 1. Imagine if Ludwig the Accursed reached 0 HP and Ludwig the Holy Blade came to life. Maybe it's lame, but it's something so minor, and something so meticulous, but it would have really got me. And after Ludwig, the party doesn't stop because the next level continues the high quality of this DLC with one of my favorite levels. This level is also in my top 10 favorite levels, so I'm gonna let my past self speak for myself. But this level is great. Along with the rest of the DLC, the level and the fishing hamlet really complement each other in a unique way. The research hall is complex and hard to navigate, and the level enemies aren't as interesting to fight. But the fishing hamlet is on the linear side and has more interesting level enemies visually and moveset wise. The research hall also does a great job at foreshadowing Lady Maria. In fact, she is probably the best foreshadowed boss for me, and seeing the insane patients call out to her is really eerie. For some, the anticipation may have been killed if you're not a fan of Living Failures, since they were expecting to see her next, only to meet an odd lore boss. But I don't mind it. I don't love fighting Living Failures, but they're new content at least. Kind of like the Ring City PvP boss is somewhat of a halt to your progress. These guys are too. But Lady Maria is worth it in every way, and in terms of a boss simply looking cool, she's probably at the very top of this DLC. I love her aesthetic, and her boss cutscene is on the simpler side, but I think it always gives me that oh shit moment. And when I get those kind of moments, they usually end up being a top tier boss. And that's exactly what she is, a top tier boss. I've spoken about her in my past videos, but she has a trait that I can only say about one boss in this entire franchise. And it's that the sum of her parts are better than her fight. Aesthetically, music, animations, and build-up are the more interesting aspects about her. Her moveset is good, it's great even. But she suffers from an unbalanced first phase. I wish her first phase was more interactive than being an R1 bot to take my anger out on. Her second and third phase are even magical, but god damn that first phase is child's play. And maybe this next line will make me sound like a nerd, but I even listen to her OST when I'm listening to music. She's a really memorable fight, even if she is too easy in my opinion. And after Lady Maria is the finale of this DLC, and guess what? I've talked about both the level and the final boss on my channel before. So I'm gonna wrap up the Old Hunters here because I can only gush about it so much. I love this DLC. This DLC fixed Bloodborne's biggest flaw. The Ring City doesn't fix any of Dark Souls 3's major issues because I would say Dark Souls 3 doesn't have a major flaw. And that's why Bloodborne is my favorite. It's a package that offers everything, and the Old Hunters helped solidify that. I say this every time I talk about this game, but I hope one day Sony ports this game to PC so we can all enjoy it. And I guess here I am with my unpopular opinion of preferring the Ring City over the Old Hunters. Just like the last section, they're both equally great, honestly. And something else I mentioned in the Bloodborne section is, well, Dark Souls 3 didn't need a saving grace. Maybe I am looking at the Souls games with a critical eye, but I think all of the Souls games had their DLC elevate weaker parts of the game itself. Dark Souls 1's DLC gives me a reason to keep playing after Ordnance Mo, Dark Souls 2's DLC saves it from being a meme, Bloodborne added some top tier bosses, and, well, I don't think Dark Souls 3 has anything particularly weak about the game itself. Sure, the world design isn't as interesting as Dark Souls 1, the areas also aren't as unique, but I can live with that stuff. There isn't something that the Ring City absolutely had to fix. And maybe that's the best part about the Ring City. It doesn't do anything super new, it's just top tier FromSoft content to say goodbye to Dark Souls. Great bosses, great atmosphere, and great levels. What more can you ask for? It has the best duo boss in the series, the best 1v1 knight type boss with Gale, and the best dragon boss. It's like FromSoft demanded this DLC to be something super memorable, and after all these years and a few playthroughs of this DLC, I remember it vividly. And believe it or not, I play games outside of Dark Souls, and I've also played a lot of DLCs, and this DLC still manages to be one of my favorite DLCs ever made. The only competition this DLC has is the Old Hunters and Phantom Liberty from Cyberpunk, which is probably tied with the Ring City. I may even prefer Phantom Liberty. I remember the first time I heard Gale's soundtrack, I got chills up my spine. It felt like the finale to your favorite TV show. You know that eventually something will come along that is the spiritual successor to that TV show, but goddammit, it's the finale, and when it's really good, it's something you won't forget for a long time. And I will not be forgetting the Ring City for a while. Even if Elden Ring doesn't have a Gale or Ludwig, I won't be disappointed. I think Elden Ring will have better level design than the previous DLCs, but the bosses in the last two DLCs we've spoken about are nearly perfect in my eyes, mainly Gale and Ludwig. But since I just brought up Elden Ring, I guess it's a good time to talk about it. Because this video isn't over just yet, so why is Shadow of the Erdtree here? It's not even out yet. Well, this is where I hope Shadow of the Erdtree will end up. I know it's setting expectations high to have it at the #1 spot, but for a DLC that is more than double of what From has charged in the past, is it really too egregious? Maybe a little, but FromSoft has never let me down with DLC packs. I mean, it even got me to break the rule of complimenting Dark Souls 2, so that counts for something. Anyway, I thought I would talk briefly about Shadow of the Erdtree since it's all on our minds. I know we all want different things, and I even asked my audience what they're most anticipating with this DLC, and the bosses won that poll. But that's oddly enough not what I want the most. I am most excited for the Legacy Dungeons, as exploring the levels is like my favorite shit to do. I essentially scour and devour the whole goddamn level just for useless, shitty items I will never use. But a part of me loves seeing an item that seems inaccessible just to caress the whole dungeon to find that one useless item that I will never use. And that's why I will praise Elden Ring's level design like I have tried to do on my channel. The bosses are fine, they work, but I see Elden Ring as the exploration game. Regardless of what you're looking forward to most, I thank you for watching the video, and I also hope you have a good day.